Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the first afternoon of the Learning Technologies Conference. I'm Stella Collins and I'm lucky enough to be the chair for this session today with the David Squared, as I've just heard them called. So we've got David Wilson and David Perring from Fosway. They're going to share some really interesting data. There was a sort of a sneak preview of it earlier on from Don. Just before I hand over to them, and they will explain themselves far better than I can, what I'd like you to do is just think about this bridge that Don was talking about earlier on, the bit about what are you going to take away with you afterwards. And in the session with Will Thalheimer this morning, we talked about the idea if you're going to measure something, you need to start at the beginning, not the end. So I want you to think now about what you might want to take away. Knowing what you already know about what this session might be about, what do you think you might want to take away? And just spend 1 minute sharing with the person next to you something that you think, this is going to be an interesting thing for me to take away and use in my role. So 1 minute between you. Okay, you've had your minute. Hopefully you weren't just discussing the lunch. And I want you to keep those thoughts in mind. So keep those thoughts in mind because we will come back to them later. But keep also an open mind, because I'm sure there's going to be some fascinating stuff that may change your mind about what you want to know. It may lead you off in directions you hadn't imagined. So I'm going to hand over to David and David.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're working live. Good afternoon. Your Heidi High moment, if anybody's old enough to remember what Heidi High is. As Stella said, we're going to talk to you today about some of our research, some of our point of view related to the learning technology market and the landscape and how it's changing, and really trying to focus on, I feel like, stripping back some of the hype layer and actually look at some of the things underneath it. And it'll be interesting to see whether, based on the reflections that you just had, there's any overlap at all. Whether we create maybe some new inspiration for you or some new challenge for you, but in particular, obviously, to try and give you some resources and some thoughts around maybe what we see is really going on from a Fosway perspective. I warn you in advance, we're going to give you lots of data. There are some copies of various resources and things, including a bit of an infographic and some 9 grids on the tables. But all of the slides that I'm going to show will be available for you to access, and I believe they've already been tweeted. If you want to download them now so you can fast forward, you can. There's a link already available through the LT19 UK hashtag, I assume, yes? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So if you're not familiar with Fosway, we're an industry analyst. What does that mean? We analyse the market around next-gen HR, talent and learning. We've been doing it for a long time. I set up Fosway in 1996. And we've really focused on trying to understand the story beneath the story, whether that's in terms of what corporates are doing, who they're doing it with, what they really think of them, what works, what's been airbrushed from history. And a number of you in this room have obviously have been part of that research process, and also including in things like roundtables and other events that we run. We also run what is, I think, pretty much the only independent vendor research on the supply options in the market around those topics. So, and I'm going to focus, obviously, today we're going to talk about learning, but we also have research around cloud HCM and talent management and something as well. So overall, we provide a whole set of different resources around things. Pretty much everything you can see there, majority of those things are just available to access on our website, and I would suggest to you, if you want to dig further, please go off and look beyond just the slides we're going to cover today. Right. So Stella asked you to maybe have a moment of reflection. I guess I'd kind of like, when we drafted this was nearly the last slide, right? So it was the summary slide that says, what are you doing today that excites you most about future of learning in your organization, okay? And I thought, why not put it first, right? Why don't we set the scene by not just looking at learning technology for its own sake, but thinking about that fundamental lens of what really is exciting about what your organization is doing around learning and how that's changing. We want to give you some resources to think about that, but I'd kind of challenge you to raise the bar, because in nearly every organization that we go into, they are struggling to do just that. That's what they need to do. They need to recalibrate. They need to move faster. They need to be more agile. They need to be more digital. But ultimately within that, you can do all of those things and it still not be that compelling, that exciting, that interesting. So I kind of frame that to you as a kind of core question. So David and I today, we're going to kind of do a bit of a double act. We'll swap between us to do parts of the presentation, and then we'll probably annoy each other publicly in front of you all, in terms of typing in comments and bits and pieces as well. One of the things that just kind of from a foundation point of view, and if you've seen us present before, we often use this kind of thing, kind of keep calm and check the facts. You can go down on the show floor and you can count the number of virtual reality headsets. You can wander around and find, lots of expensive stands with big video panels and everything else. But ultimately, try and understand what is really going on. In other words, what's beneath the hype? What is really the substance? The data, so Don in the opening session should put up an infographic which was based on some of the data that you can see there. Just to give you an idea around that, we've run this, what we call digital learning realities research for a number of years. And
4 years.
4 years.
Fourth year.
We're still in the process of connecting the data for this year, but we wanted to be able to pull that. We had 800 respondents, as you can see so far, and obviously we're hoping, if you haven't done it, please go off and complete it afterwards as well. About 88% of those are European, right? So, and for the majority, 2/3 are from organizations employing more than 1,000 people. So it's typically a mid and large enterprise type audience with a very heavy kind of focus around Europe and international. That, for us, is really important because I think you can look at these topics, and we all know that we live in a tech market that's probably dominated by what comes from North America. But unfortunately, the world is more complicated than the Bay Area, if ever you've been there. And particularly in Europe, obviously, you don't get very big before you become multinational or multi-business unit. And when you look at learning strategies and HR strategies more generally, the majority of organizations have got decentralized operating models. There's a lot of complexity around it. So trying to understand what really works in Europe is also really relevant than what works overall. A key question that we've kind of been asking a little bit in a number of different ways, but we're really interested in how the nature of work and the workforce is changing the way and accelerating a lot of the drivers around the way that learning needs to change. And I think this is a really interesting question. Do you think that what you're doing is fit for that modern workforce? More than 50% of people, and that actually, the number we had last time was even higher, wasn't it?
Yeah.
More than 50% of organizations think it isn't. So there is a real challenge, I think, for L&D and for the digital learning world, not just to be more relevant, but also to be more relevant to that future audience as well. So I just kind of, again, put that up on the table at the beginning, thinking about that actually the challenge here is pretty significant. So I guess if we pick that statistic as a starter, I think one of the things that you then think about then is why, right? Why is that not relevant to the modern workforce? We can hear a lot of noise around, well, we put our LMS in to run our compliance training, and it's not a great learner experience. Okay? We can hear things around the growth in video, social, micro-learning, and everything else. There's lots of things we can talk about in terms of tech trends. AR, VR, AI, lots of acronyms. But actually, what really will make it relevant to the organization of the future, in fact, the organization in some cases of today. Your audience is getting away from you. How can you keep up with it? So, what isn't fit? What do we need to change? How do I look at my suppliers and think about how fit they are for that world? And that's what we're trying to do with a lot of our research, is really think about underneath it where these things are going. So I wanted to just kind of paraphrase this with this, just again, a little bit of a sense around where organizations are around digital, and then I'm going to hand over to David, and he's going to kind of deep dive into some of the related subtopics. So Again, we're quite interested in the old digital transformation story. So one of the things that, again, we're looking at when we look at business, HR, learning, understand where they are in that journey. You'll see a lot of orange. Okay? Orange means in progress. So that hides a multitude of sins from anywhere from barely started to think I've finished, but I've just realized I'm only on the first leg of my journey. So there's a big thing. Very few organizations think they've kind of digitally transformed so far. And if you look at learning, we've got about 68% of organizations in that in progress. We've got 25% just still planning. Okay, so if you think about how long the learning technology industry has been around, how much noise there is around digital learning, a lot of organizations are still thinking about, from a digital point of view, how they transform those learning functions. When you drive in and look a little bit about the experience of things, and again, we'll come back and talk about some of this probably a bit later on, what you see is a very interesting picture. So what this graph shows you is the view of quality, and the grading here is from very good down to poor with a not applicable. So not applicable means, by definition, that's not something they're doing. What you can see is, I think, two key things. First of all, the amount of not applicable probably is bigger than the amount of applicable. Yeah? So more people are not doing these things than they are doing them. The other thing is when you look at it, is when you look at the ratio between the green and maybe the orange and red, what you realize is actually there's only about, at best, in most cases, 50% is green. You know, we hear a lot of things around video. We know there's a massive growth in video. That looks pretty compelling when I start to come down here with a lot of these things, micro-learning. Yeah? More people think it's either just acceptable or bad or poor than think it's good or very good. So one of the things to think about is not just where am I going and what are all these new things, but how is it going to work for me and how good is it and what do I need in my suppliers to really make it work. If I look at the same thing for learning platforms, okay, by far the most deployed of those is obviously the LMS, right? And we know that in the world of learning technology, there's a lot of noise around LMSs. People hate their LMSs. They're going to turn them off. They're not fit for purpose, etc. Except actually in reality, they're not. As you can see, the vast majority of organizations have got, in terms of this sample, bear in mind we're looking at a learning technology audience typically, have got these things, and actually less than 1% based on our research are actually looking to turn them off. The thing is they've changed their mind about what they want to use them for. They want to use them for other things, okay? But we know that the satisfaction around LMSs and the noise is quite significant. But actually, when you look at it across everything else, analytics platforms, virtual classrooms, learning record stores, social platforms, again, there's an awful lot of, oh, it's okay, or worse. Okay, so think about some of those things. Just because it's the high hype doesn't mean it's actually very necessarily deliverable.
And I think one to pick out is the one around learning experience platforms. So actually there's about 30% who have started to explore using the learning experience platform in our survey so far. But again, only half of those think what they've got is good, which is a bit weird, isn't it? Because that's one of the platforms that you'd expect to drive a better experience. You'd expect people to be happier. So there is, I think, a strong element of caveat emptor, buyer beware. You need to have a strong purpose and a strong driver, and be thinking really seriously about how you tie in the learner's perception of what they need and tie it down to their context as well to make sure you're buying solutions that add value and that are desirable and desired.
So again, just kind of reflecting on that, why is the customer's view of those, of that so variable? Why have we got, at best, pretty much on average, a 50-50 chance of it being seen as a good thing? How is this changing over time? I talked about with the LMS that organizations put them in for one purpose, compliance and learning administration, and now they want it to be a great learner experience. They've moved the goalpost. Right? So this is clearly, the lens we're using to judge this has also changed to some degree. How do you manage innovation, in that? So there was a long list of new things that you could be doing, but how do I think about that in your organization? How do you think about that and work out where that fits in the bigger jigsaw. So one of the things I like to do is just to take just the idea, build a bit of interaction, take a couple of minutes and just reflect on those questions on the table.
So I think we've got, effectively, there's 3 questions. One is, what do you do to maximize quality of your learning solutions? How has that changed over time? And how do you manage innovation?
So, at the risk of, we've got a lot of people here, but if we just take a sample from a couple of tables, any comments from anybody? So why is the customer experience so variable here?
I'd be really interested to know, when you mention quality, can you define quality?
Can I define it, or do I want to do it
in there? How is that defined as quality? Is that the user experience? Is that the program? Is it?
So obviously, from a point of view of the overall survey process, this is it's an aggregated question. It's not with lots of sub-bullets around it. So, but obviously, I think the sense that we also ask lots of this from other ways. Around customer sat, we can ask it from different directions as well. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think we've just left it as very open, right? So do you think it's good or it's not very good? The details probably hopefully come out a little bit in the discussion about what you think is good. And maybe actually that's something that maybe we can try and surface a little bit now, because we're curious, right? That's only part of the answer. Actually, the more detailed, interesting bit is, why do you buy stuff that's not very good? What the hell is going on?
Just restate that. Why do you buy stuff that isn't very good? Why do you buy things where there's probably, on average, a 50% chance of it being a good outcome, maybe even if you make a good decision? All right? So, and I'm not being accusatory there. I'm just saying the reality is that's what happens. When we research this, and we were researching it in depth for a long time, 20 years, the parameters change a little bit over time, but ultimately we're recreating the same non-learning experience, if I can call it like that. It's a Groundhog Day. Okay? Whether it's now about a learning experience platform, and last year, 10 years ago, it was about an LMS. Doesn't matter. We've got the same kind of things going on underneath it. But let's drill into some of the specifics. Any other comments or questions from anybody? Oh, interesting.
This lady here.
Yeah, I think it's got to boil down to the outcomes that you're after, hasn't it? If you know what you're trying to achieve, then you buy the right thing for it. But I asked this in the last presentation as well. There's so much being developed and so many new things coming so quickly. Yeah. And there's no evidence that they work. Where is the research that says we've used this and it's made people better learners?
Yeah.
It works, technically. It plugs into things. But how do you know that it works for the learner? You don't.
Yeah, and I think to some degree, I mean, that's what we're trying to address. We're trying to actually objectively measure through a whole bunch of different techniques, whether that's from survey and the detailed kind of, obviously, corporate interviews and so on, to understand what really works and what doesn't, from that. But anyway, let's move on and talk about some of the pieces beneath it.
And I think we'll come back to your observation, because one of the questions we asked is, how effectively do L&D measure the impact of learning? And 14% said they do it effectively, right? It scares life out of me, but I think that is a very root cause. So we'll go through that. So building a digital learning ecosystem. I think one of the biggest challenges that you face as an audience is how you build an ecosystem of different solutions, be it content and platform and experience. And that seems to be growing increasingly in complexity. It seems to be becoming increasingly hard as different layers come in. And what we've been sort of trying to help people think about is how complex things are when you even just look at the context of learning. And we've effectively created 3 broad buckets of environment, so to speak, where you can think this is where learning happens. The first being, to some extent, an area that people don't necessarily take that seriously, but is important if you want to try and develop a little bit of a learning culture, is around, actually, people learn just because it's for their own personal joy, right? So people learn stuff because it's entertainment. Yeah, there's things that I like to watch on YouTube that inform me and entertain me and make me grow as an individual. There's things around actually mastery. I want to be a black belt in Taekwondo. I am actually not, and maybe can't talk about that. But you may want to be a black belt in Taekwondo. Actually, sometimes you might want to do a little bit of learning about what's been happening in Coronation Street, because that's what the people in your office talk about, and you want to be involved in the discussion. So there's a strong sense of belonging, because you want to fit, right? And you want to be able to have the conversations, have the connection with people. And so there's loads of other reasons, like problem solving. You've got to change the bulb in your car. You go and find out how. Maybe you don't. But maybe just curiosity. Sometimes it's serendipity. Something pops up. Somebody says, you should read this. Why don't you have a look? And there's that whole sense of just personal growth that goes on every day, that you think, actually, as part of a learning organization, how do you stimulate that? How do you nurture that in your organization to show that actually it's good to learn, reward, recognize it? That's a whole ecosystem in its own right. Then in the center bit, we've got this whole area around impact now. So we talk about operational learning. So that's the learning that you come across for new systems, new starters, compliance, new products. There's things around performance gaps. There's things around anything that your business demands of you because it's going through a business change. And those are things that you probably have to deliver in terms of just to survive as a business on a 3 to 4 month cycle. And I think the interesting thing for most organizations is the pace of change, right? You used to get away with maybe having 1 product launch a year. Then you maybe had to have 2 product launches a year. Now you're into agile development, you're doing 1 a quarter or 1 every 2 months or 1 every month. Maybe you don't really have a finished product. It's all minimum viable product and everything's evolving, everything. Continuous beta, right? So you've got this whole continuous program of people have to learn all the time, and otherwise they're not up to speed with your business. And I think that's a massive challenge. But if you think about the ecosystem that supports that, very few organizations have things that can support performance management and learning and social performance management. And I mean that just by having your after-action reviews, your reflection, saying, actually, we tried this, it didn't work, I should do that. It's nothing to do with L&D, really, but you can facilitate those conversations. Then there's all the stuff about license to operate. You can't sell a mortgage unless you've been on this course and been qualified. Otherwise, we get done for mis-selling. And you still might get done for mis-selling, but at least we train people. All things around bite-sized learning, actually it's little chunks because it's continuously moving. Thinking about performance optimization, having the system suggest the right next step because that's the right thing to do in this particular process. Finding a system that can do all of that, plus the personal learning, wow. Anybody found one yet? If you put your hand up, everybody's going to jump on you, right? Because there's a multitude of solutions that you need to try and build, try and knit this together. And then, if you think about your survival as a business, maybe 2 to 3 years out, what capabilities do you need to have? What sort of skills do you need to have in blockchain or AI or whatever other robotics that you don't currently have in your organization? And what approach to innovation do you need in your leaders to cope with the changes in the future? How the hell do you manage that? So you've got all this thing around future readiness, which you tend to find embedded in talent management platforms, which help people think about their long-term career development. You can't find a solution that answers every problem on here. It becomes a multiple-layered, multiple-situational, multiple-persona. I was going to say a bad word there, but a bit of a screw-up, right? Because you've got to try and stitch that together. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that you face, effectively creating this whole employee proposition of, actually, I help you grow as an individual, I help you improve your performance as an organization, and I'm building you out for the future, right? It's a big ask. But that's what most organizations are asking of you. And finding a solution that can do that and knit it together. Big challenge, and I think that's one of the reasons why we find it so hard to try and knit this together.
So you know, when it comes back to, when you talk about a system for learning, the concept is failed before it's even started. There's no such thing as a system. It's an ecosystem of systems. And that's the challenge we've got. And one of the reasons that customer satisfaction or the quality kind of assessment around it is those goalposts are moving. You know, these cycles are getting faster and faster, and they're getting away more from us. And we're looking at throwing new solutions, new technology at that to solve part problems, but we don't know how to put it all together.
And I think and that sense of goalpost moving, if you think about just to operational training, actually we just had to deliver the training, and maybe we had to provide a little bit of licensing, so there was some certification, just to show people were good to go. Now there's all these other layers that you want to include. I want it to be much more social. That's a richer learning experience. Wasn't in our old platform. Now I'm expecting the existing platform to do the same. Sometimes that doesn't come as quickly as you need it to, and I think that also creates some of the dissonance, some of the dissatisfaction as well. So let's move on. Okay, so But besides all that, there is a massive hunger for investing more in learning technology. And the interesting thing about this is actually just look at the chart. So on balance, because you've got this, the green that says increase spend, the orange you say leave it the same, and the red is the small bit where we're going to try and decrease spend, and other people don't know. But effectively, as long as the green is bigger than the red, it's growing. Okay? That's the big news. And if you just do a visual check, and I'm going to close my eyes, all the greens are bigger than the reds. Each one of these areas is growing, and you can see the areas that are growing most. People are obsessed by content. Okay? Content is the biggest obsession. And to some extent, content is also one of your biggest enemies in terms of trying to create active, real, deep learning. Because actually, that's something that people do, not something people consume. But most of the platforms themselves are geared up to feed the content, because that's what's easy to sell to you, and having the content solutions or management systems to then make sure that people just go for the right content almost creates a little bit of a vicious circle, because you forget that actually we need to do a lot more social work. We need to do a lot more action-based learning. We need to do a lot more assessment and diagnostics. We need to tie that into a much broader sense of developing people through conversation. It starts to fragment. So something just to think about. But overall, everybody's going to invest more. But you know that what people are buying isn't necessarily fit for the modern workforce, so you have to be really careful. What I love about this slide is it gives me an immense amount of hope. And it gives me that hope because if you look at all the items, and maybe ignore the percentages at the moment, what it gives you an idea is a manifesto for how you can make learning better. And everybody in this room, to some extent, if you've participated in the survey, and I assume you have because you turned up, is all focused on this sort of sweet spot of, yes, blended learning is a bloody good idea. We should do more of that. Video, what a great tool, right? It's what people consume. My kids, I cannot get them off YouTube unless I switch the router off. User-generated content, what a fantastic thing. Not just to communicate new ideas, but to show that people know. Okay? It's not about user-generated content just to broadcast, but to say, show me your pitch, show me how you sell, and before I put you in front of a really expensive customer, I will get you great feedback from the person who owns the product and the marketing director, right? What a fantastic thing. That's genuine, really important user-generated content, flipping the concept a little bit on its head. Micro-learning, actually giving people small chunks is a really good idea, but in different contexts, right? That's all about performance support. And things around performance support, I think you put those together. But when you tie them all together, it makes something that feels really powerful to me. And I think if that's part of your manifesto for how you expect learning to change, then that's really hopeful. That's the thing that will start to whip the providers to get them into shape about delivering what you need. And equally on the learning platforms, analytics is a wonderful thing because actually if we can focus that to support the learner rather than use it as a tool to beat learners up through their managers and their HR organisations, we can help them make better choices rather than hiding our heads in the sand. And all these things around social collaborative, again, it feels like a manifesto of doing better learning in our organisations. And actually contextualising that to particular individuals, particular personas is a wonderful thing to do. So that gives me a lot of hope. Hopefully that's given you some insight there. Go. Okay, so where do you intend to change your learning platforms in the future? So where do people expect to grow their demand? The top of the list, or the top three, are analytics and dashboards. I think we have to be really careful of that. Focus it on the end user, not HR. I think that's one of the obsessions. Authoring content, okay, LMS up there. Social collaborative, down the bottom, next-gen learning environments and learning record stores.
So the green on that is intention to change within 12 months. Yeah, or green and orange within 2 years. So as you can see, again, there's a lot of intention to change. There's a reason why the floor downstairs in the expo hall is full of bigger stands who are spending more money to attract more of your attention. You know, because there's a lot of change going on, and go back David's thing about increased investment pretty much across every area, lots of innovation, new stuff that people haven't done before, and a high intention to change. So there's a kind of perfect storm at the moment where people are trying to do this. But it's, as I said, think about it as ecosystem, not simply the system.
And again, looking at the size of the bars, the things that you think maybe that are most innovative, things around learning experience, aren't necessarily top of people's agenda. They're still trying to do the very basic things. And that's because actually our expectations around adoption so far probably aren't as mature as we think they should be. Okay. So, question around learning investment. How do you make sure you're investing in the right amount, in the right areas for your business? What's the best fit for you and why? Do you understand your case for change? I think that's those again, if you can't articulate those, then you need some help, because that's the basis of making a good decision. You need to be driving business value. Now, David, I don't know if you want us to go through a little table discussion or...
No, let's go on to the next one. I'm just kind of conscious of time.
Okay, so just to give you a sense of what priorities are, again, everything's a priority, right? And if you look down this, actually there's not many things that are that different. Even from top to bottom, from the ones that are at the top saying around measuring learning outcomes and success, which goes back to what the lady said earlier on, it's going up the agenda, which is again a great point for being positive. Multi-channel learning delivery, amazingly that's still something that people are pushing, moving out. And I say amazingly because I'd expect it to be higher anyway, but the demand for that is increasing. Thinking about supporting employees' application of learning on the job. One of my particular passions, Gloria Gray wrote a book in 1984 or something like that about performance support. We seem to be, almost 30, 40 years later, just about in the position where we're thinking about doing it a standard in our organizations, which is incredible because actually that's where the rubber hits the road. People needing support when they're actually getting back into the workplace, you'd think that would be the most important part, right? Actually doing stuff. And then further down, supporting individuals' decisions around learning. There's not that much difference, but very few people doing less, right? We're talking about maybe 20%. Everybody else pushing forward. So actually the focus of investment, the focus of priority for change is broad, right? It's not just one thing that stands out. But looking at the digital learning approach, things that you're looking to improve, top of the list is learner engagement. How do I create better learner engagement? And that's amazing, right? So, but it's consistent with the things that we're seeing people look to maybe buy in the marketplace. And equally, reporting and analytics, integration with other systems. To me, those next two are something that I think is something that's going to be a dramatic change in how we think about proving the value of learning departments. Because that integration, if that's not into your business systems, then you're probably not focusing on the right data. So probably I think one of the biggest challenges for everybody in this room over the next 5 years is to find ways of connecting what learning people do to the outcomes that creates in the business. And the only way you're going to get that really is by connecting into your business systems. Potentially it's the scariest thing that you could do, because it's like showing everything, right? There's no hiding to say whether we do an effective job. You're really showing that you're making a difference. But the thing for me is that if you've got a hood over the top of your head and you cannot see what's coming, then it's going to hit you anyway. If you can take the head off and see there is a charging rhinoceros because you haven't got any insight, then at the point when you've taken that hood off, then you can see what's coming, you can move. So there is an important thing about this being about intelligence. When people talk about reporting and analytics, think about intelligence. What intelligence does it give you as an L&T function or the individual to make a better choice? And that's how we need to think about surfacing that. But all the way down the bottom, things like gamification, AI, machine learning, again, that's the important things are much more about trying to make a difference and show value. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that, David.
No, I think the one thing I would say is if you split that into two and take the top six and the bottom six, and there's a sort of a bit of a step down there. Yeah. But look on the top six, managing formal learning and managing compliance, which were two of the things that drove you to put some of those learning systems in the first place, have not gone away. There is a reason why people are not turning their LMSs off, is because, however much they don't like them and everything else, is because they have no choice but to have them. Right? You need to be compliant. You need to be able to manage the learning process. Nobody's going to give you more budget to spend on learning administrators. So being efficient about those things, it's an and, right? We want all of these things now, not just one of them. And again, come back to the question earlier. One of the challenges of satisfaction, we seem to think there's a silver bullet, that we can change from this platform to that platform or this partner to that partner, and it's going to magically solve all the problems. As David said, it's a very multi-layer, very complex kind of set of things we're actually trying to do, many of which actually aren't really in learning or L&D's ownership anyway. Yeah. So we're trying to kind of work across that, but just think about this in a grown-up way. Think about it about all of the key things that you've got to do, the non-negotiables as well as the things that are nice to have. And I don't mean nice to have in this sense, I mean in terms of the, is learner experience, is learner engagement, is personalization, are these really things that are driving business value and ultimately recalibrating back on that?
And I think that's such a powerful thing. So when you think about learning engagement as being the top item, if that's not driving business value and you can't report that through integrating with business systems, what was the point of business having that greater engagement? If I was your CFO, I'd say, so why are you taking more people out of my business, making them less productive, and you've got no proof that it's making a difference?
And that comes back to the thing before. We've got all these new toys, but do any of them really make a difference? So we need to be able to prove that.
So the other thing that I think is interesting is how HR systems are starting to drive people's decision making. We're seeing some really interesting things around some HCM platforms, which are starting to wag the rest of the HR body, so to speak, all the way through all the different silos, from talent acquisition to performance to succession planning to learning. So there are people starting to make very severe compromises on the functionality because they've been told, we're going to have one HR system that does everything. There's only one. We're going to have to get rid of everything else. And people are trying to wrestle with how they navigate that. And already for, almost 20%, HR systems are exerting a significant influence on their choices around how they work. And the interesting thing is, if you can't articulate the reasons why you need more performance support, why you need more active learning in the workflow, which those systems will not provide, then you're going to have to say goodbye to those systems that you do have that do that. So it's something that's a really big challenge. And again, maybe from the talent suite side of things as well, that they don't tend to provide you with that access point into the workflow.
This is a thing that comes in waves. You know, there's a 7-year cycle about the way that people look at that HR, and we're in a wave at the moment where organizations are looking at, and they're looking at Workday, they're looking at SAP again and Oracle and moving it all to the cloud, etc. And however much you might look at it and go, well, that's not fit for purpose, that's a worse experience, you're a junior partner of that in that decision process. And we've seen projects with very specific business drivers who, around learning, get completely sideswiped and put on ice just because they're deploying something else, and therefore, inevitably, we're going to use that for learning. You've got to be able to make a really strong case as to how you kind of do that. But again, 60% of the people here are running learning platforms. More are running multiple than single. Okay, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's about proving these things are more effective than some of these for the things you're doing. Now, what's really interesting for us is we run all the research that we run on learning, we also run on HR and talent. So we've got these kind of two separate windows on everything. And you'd think the Venn diagrams between those two worlds should really overlap a lot, and they don't. Organizations, we have overlap loads, but actually the individuals in them don't. The learning community is very isolated actually from a lot of its HR brethren, and actually where it does get engaged with them, often it's as a junior rather than as a senior partner in that process, and that's a huge challenge.
And HR, to some extent, becomes a steamroller, and you have to be very careful. But overall, we don't see very much standardization, and I think to some extent that's probably to be expected because of the number of contexts and the number of different personas you're trying to support as a learning function, right? So everything from performance support to optimization, etc. But I think the interesting thing is there is a small slice who are standardized. And I think, again, thinking about the pressures around that standardization, it tends to come from HCM. That tends to be one of the key drivers around why it's been standardized. And the limits that puts around you as a learning function can be quite severe. Okay, so this just goes into a little bit more detail. The highest standardization around learning platforms comes around the LMS, 50%. Then everything else is quite, I suppose, layers of chaos to some extent. You've got content authoring, where there's only about 20% very standardized. You've got learning record stores, about 20%. Virtual classrooms, 20%. How does that happen? Social learning environments, maybe 15%. Learning analytics reports, 15%. Learning experience platforms, 10%. Have consistency around it. Incredible. And then MOOCs, 10%. So actually, overall, LMS to some extent have done a pretty good job of cornering the marketplace and creating some consistency. Whereas actually the other areas tend to be much more diverse, which again makes sense a little bit if you think about the context and how fractured that is. But the challenge is, how do you create a continuous experience from one step to another? How do you make sure that you create a bridge that actually makes people feel as though they can navigate their way through? And I think that's a little bit harder than we tend to think. So, how are your solutions changing? What's driving that change? What have been the most radical changes you made in your approach to learning technology? Who's driving those changes? What changes have made the most positive or negative impact?
So in the interest of giving you a bit of relief from us, why don't you spend a couple of minutes, think about that last question particularly, in terms of the new stuff that you've done, what really has a positive impact, a negative impact, and why? So please talk about amongst yourselves for a couple of minutes.
Thank you. So the question is, what changes have had the most positive or negative impact for you in terms of the new things that you've started to do, or things that you've been doing for a while?
And as a person, just sit there and think about, take away one negative impact and don't do it.
Okay.
Right?
So what we'll do is give you a few minutes and then we'll get some answers from you.
So, anybody want to share anything quickly?
So who's doing something that they think is really positive? Please, one hand go up.
Yeah. Can we have one person do something positive? Okay.
Thank you.
Great person. And?
I think we've got a... There you go.
Thank you.
Time to say
Actually, I
thank
feel
you.
slightly embarrassed because we go down that long list of all of the things that a learning community wants, and I'm from IBM, and
Yep.
it feels like we've got all of those things.
Yep.
So we kind of drink our own champagne.
Yeah, cool. Good sell.
And we've just been in the process of commercialising it all. I completely agree that it is an ecosystem of tools. It's not just one thing, not one solution, but we're welcome to talk.
So is there one thing you would highlight as being particularly successful in terms of some of those things?
Well, two things. I mean, absolutely you need a learner experience, a Netflix
Yeah.
experience with cool content, but it's cultural change driven from the top that actually drives change in the workforce.
Okay, perfect.
I think
Thank you.
just to pick out IBM as an example, I think we've seen some really nice things around MICA, which stands for My Career.
Yeah,
And it's a chatbot engine that enables people to find their way through what my next role should be and the opportunities around that of asking a question. So what job should I do next? And then to bring in the connector content that you've got is really powerful. So you get psychometrics, say, would you be happy in that job? Oh, by the way, here's a job for you, right? It's not the traditional career development process. It's a much more shortcut, faster, richer experience because actually the job gets pushed to you as well. Amazing, right? And I think that's for me, I think that's some of the shift we're seeing. So I just wanted to call that out because it's something we've seen very impressive from what you guys have been doing.
Anybody brave enough to share a negative? Andy?
I was expecting all hands to go up.
No, come on. We've got to balance it out. We don't want to be too positive, okay? We've got to have...
End on a high.
You.
The negative is not doing what we're doing positively.
Right. Okay. That's a ducking the question, I think. Okay. All right. Let me move on quickly then. And I want to try and speed up for the last kind of section because I want to enable some time to put up some of our Fosway 9-grid research. So the last bit, I want to go back almost to where we started with, and some of the things that we discussed is what really does make a difference. When you ask organisations, you know, what's the kind of demand for about showing the business value of what they do? Yeah, and again, the context here is digital learning. You know, there is a pretty significant demand. If you look at significant and some, you know, only 27% of people are saying that there's little demand for it to show what the business value of this is. I think, again, going back to the point somebody made earlier about starting from the beginning, right, is if you bake that into whatever you're building, you know, thinking about what shows that this really makes a difference rather than what just shows that we've got nicer looking tech, because that dates, okay? There's one thing we've learned from green screens to Windows to Amazon to Netflix to anything else is the idea beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and the beholder changes their mind over time as to what's beautiful, right? So you know, and we haven't even gone anywhere near any demographic conversations and Gen Y, Gen Z, and anything else like that. So, you know, the idea of what's beautiful. But at the end of the day, business value should transcend all of those things. When you ask people what measure they use, activity is still by far the last one. So employee participation rates is still like the #1 measure by quite a long way. And this is, again, I don't want to get into this now. We've done a lot of work in the past looking at business impact, measuring performance, Kirkpatrick, or the redundancy in some ways of some of these things. But we still, as L&D, are too fixated on activity. How many things have we delivered? How many student days have we done? What's our completion levels, right? Not, does anybody actually do their job better, And I want to say that in a fairly harsh way, because that's the harsh reality, is if we cannot engage with the core question of do they do their job better, are they more likely to stay with us, you know, will they be able to respond when all this thing about agile organizations, are we able to respond to the business changes we need to make? Those are the things that matter. That's what L&D has to prove itself against, not how many people liked their lunch. Yeah. The other thing is, and this is again a really interesting question, is how effectively do you measure it today? Again, 53% saying it's ineffective. 33% not at all. Only 14 saying it's effective. So go back to that thing about what really makes a difference. Build this into the core of what you do. Think about this. Don't just be fixated about greater learner engagement and so on. I'm going to skip those questions. So we've talked about a whole bunch of things. We've got a sense around there's growth. As David said, there's a lot of opportunity. There's some great things going on around use of video. We're seeing blended learning, you know, that's a 20-year-old topic. It's like now right at the top of a lot of people's thing. Again, eventually after 20, 25 years, they're actually started to work out that this is relevant to do. There's a lot of mandate for change. Having better learner experiences has clearly got to be a good thing. But ultimately, how does this drive the decisions that you make? And when you go down on the show floor downstairs, how does that change the way you look at those vendors? The criteria we now have to use to look at these solutions, and this is looking at our functional kind of way we assess a lot of the learning systems, you know, it's got really complex. You know, we used to just worry about how good they were at managing a classroom training process that the learner never saw. They just maybe requested to book on something. And now we've got all these different types of learning. We're really focused about how we build relationships with the learners, how we engage with them. We've got all the reporting that we want to do. We want to hook it into HR. We want to hook it into talent. We want to hook it into analytics. We've got all these things we're doing. It's a very complex landscape. And the challenge is the vendors, you know, this is the world they're living in. They're all moving this stuff. In fact, they're all moving their stuff faster than you can consume it. The biggest challenge for the vendors is innovating customers, not innovating product. Okay? And that's a challenge we throw at that vendor community quite strongly. They're not necessarily great at working out how you adopt all those new features that are in that next the next version of that SaaS release that comes along. When we look at this, of course, what it does is it makes us reassess the way we do things. So I said earlier that this is pretty much the only European-based vendor analysis that's available. This is for learning systems. I'm going to show you one for digital learning in a minute. We have a monster process basically in the background that's constantly assessing the corporate view of everything, customer satisfaction, independent vendor briefings, functional assessments, demonstrations. You would scare you to, and we try and distill all of that back down to looking at how the vendors themselves are responding to that. Okay, and this is a Fosway 9 grid. You can see the performance of the vendors. You can see the potential of the vendors. You can see how expensive they are. Right, blue. High cost of ownership, orange, mid cost of ownership, green, lower cost of ownership. What is the right fit for your organization in terms of capability? You know, we went into this cycle for this update, which has just been released a couple of weeks ago, with the intention of culling and reducing the number of vendors on there. We track a couple of hundred vendors in every segment. You know, we only want to put really 25 maybe on there, but for all the ones we cut out, we ended up adding almost the same number again. So actually, the pressure is for all the consolidation in the market, we're seeing new entrants come in, new players in there, and look downstairs and walk around. There'll be loads of people you've never heard of. However experienced you are in the market, there are a whole bunch of new players. And you walk up to them, and they've got a stand that's 25 feet high with lots of lights on, and you're going, bloody hell, that's expensive. Yeah? So, like, where does that money come from? You know, there is a lot of money being focused on this market and on the innovation and potential. Not least to go back to those statistics we talked before about growth in investment, propensity to change stuff, new technologies coming on. There's a lot of opportunity in the market space. So I'm not going to go through and talk through the detail of anything on this. We're actually going to run a session downstairs on our stand in the expo floor after this, if anybody's specifically interested in talking about any of the 9 grids. specifically. They appear a lot in buying cycles. We get a lot of organizations that download them, etc. So we know that they're out there being used a lot. Digital learning, again, the same thing. It's what makes a strong digital learning partner for you. The criteria around this are changing. It used to be about bespoke e-learning content and maybe some customized platforms. Now it's about everything. All those things that we listed earlier are saying people want. That's what they want their digital learning partners to do. They want content in all these different forms and so on. So there's a lot of changing criteria around them. And obviously the vendors themselves change enormously. They may be making acquisitions. They're growing into new markets. They're all launching an LXP. Okay? They're all doing AI. We'll do probably 30, 40 meetings here at the show. And every show we do with vendors talking around what they're doing, every one of them has got rebooting the user experience. They've got an AI and machine learning, and they're all focusing on analytics, etc., regardless of what they then are, right? As well as whatever they're doing in their core. So there's a massive change on the vendor side. So overall, when we're looking at the vendors, we've got to understand how those fit into those business priorities. I think the thing is, if you go back and think about all of those, you can look at these in an absolute sense in their own right. The key question is, how do they fit against your priorities? How do they fit against what you're trying to do as an organization? And if you're in a big organization or a small organization, if you're growing or you're declining, if you've got a massive innovation that's supposed to be going on and you're reinventing your business, you're trying to become agile, what are the things driving your organizations and how you look at those? What are those drivers for change and how are they reflected into your supplier choices? We see far too many people focus on this as a functional selection process. Okay? How do these partners help you drive your success? How do you elevate it away from that 50-50 gamble that even if you know what you're doing, you still pick somebody with a 50% chance of a good outcome? Okay, so that sort of thing. And the final, obviously, question from our point of view, how do things like the 9 grids and the research and the data points that we're giving you, how do they help you make those decisions better? So I think, the data that we've talked about, as said, is available to download. There's an online version of the infographic as well. The slides are already on our website if anybody wants to download the detailed slides. There will be some reports or a series of reports that come out focusing on different parts of the story. We've done that for the last couple of years. So if you go on our website, you can also look at those previous slides. You've also got other research. There are the other 9 grids and also things around on the HR side or talent or whatever it is. So there's plenty of content out there from us. Please, have a look at that. And thank you very much for your attention.
Time for some questions, gents?
Yes.
Want to take some questions?
Questions, anybody?
Who's got a question?
Can I have?
Or an observation?
It's too warm in here. No? Thank you very much.
Who should I use?
Got no questions at all? You must have done a good
Stunned
job.
silence. There you go.
Okay, well, if there are really no questions, then I've got one for you. In a moment, we're going to thank the Davids. But what I'd like to know from you first is, what are you going to take away? What are you going to take back to work, this bridge? What are you going to apply? So if you think from this session you've got some kind of something you're going to take back, you're going to immediately take action, I'd like you to stand up. Not stand up and leave the room, just stand up. So something that you think that's given... Go on, stay standing up. I'm not going to ask you anything. I'm just going to... Okay, if you think you've got food for thought, I'd like you to stand up. Lots and lots of food for thought. And if you think, I really need to go away and think about this stuff and evaluate it and think more before I can take any action, I'd like you to stand up. Keep standing, those are already up. Okay, and those who are standing and those who are still sitting and haven't decided what they're going to do yet. Can I ask you to give the 2 Davids from Fosway a big round of applause?